Hello YouTube. Today we're going to be broaching a difficult subject for some, death. Today's aphorism has been put many ways by many people throughout history, both near and far. From Euripides, "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees," to YOLO of modern teenagers, people have noticed that we tend to live once if we live at all, and that this should compel us to some kind of action. More on that later. However, today we'll be investigating Marcus Aurelius' phrasing of this notion in his Meditations, which goes as follows. "Since it is possible that thou mayest depart from life this very moment, regulate every act and thought accordingly." But before we get to the aphorism proper, a little information about Aurelius and the Meditations is in order. Aurelius was a Roman emperor, last of the 5 so-called good emperors. He lived from April 121 AD to March 180 AD. His death is considered the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, the beginning of its so-called collapse, though it might be better described as more of a slow rot or decay than a collapse. But I digress. There aren't a ton of great sources about his life. Many are sketchy, contradictory, etc. So I'm not going to go into any depth about it here, but I will say that being an important Roman emperor, there is a lot of speculation and quite a few old texts that reference him, and you can get a good sense of this by looking at the Wikipedia article, which is surprisingly good. It has about 300 citations in it. So you can actually get a pretty good grasp of his historical context just from reading the Wikipedia article and then looking more deeply into a few of the sources used. Just keep in mind, though, that like all ancient stuff, much or most of what we know is really conjecture and educated guessing. So anyway, Marcus kind of accidentally, in a way, wrote a book that was not intended for public consumption. It was essentially a kind of philosophical journal that he wrote in consistently. We know this book today as the Meditations. So some interesting things about the Meditations. Since this work is more the work of someone doing some thinking in the morning in various places, different parts were written at different times, and it's not always clear where or when, it's not meant to be systematic or particularly rigorous, though there are certain threads and themes that continue throughout the Meditations. Some of these themes are death, devotion to community, figuring out how to live amongst people in a socially positive way, the need for courage in the face of adversity, stoicism, and things like that. So when you read the Meditations, you really get a sense of a person trying to convince themselves to be better. Almost like he's not entirely convinced, or he's entirely that person, but he's working out the ideas to best figure out how to apply them in his life. It's a very practical kind of feeling you get from reading it. It really shows that philosophical principle has important applications in real life, and it isn't all just a bunch of pie-in-the-sky idealism or some such, which is one reason why I really like it. And it's considered one of the primary works of Stoicism. So if you're studying Stoicism, it's pretty much a mandatory read. But enough about the Meditations as a whole. Let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at the aphorism in context. So I'm going to quote the Meditations here. This is from Book 2 of the Meditations. And it goes as follows. Quote, "Since it is possible that thou mayest depart from life this very moment, regulate every act and thought accordingly. But to go away from among men, if there are gods, is not a thing to be afraid of, for the gods will not involve thee in evil, but if indeed they do not exist, or if they have no concern about human affairs, what is it to me to live in a universe devoid of gods or devoid of providence? But in truth they do exist, and they do care for human beings, and they have put all the means in man's power to enable him not to fall into real evils. And as to the rest, if there was anything evil, they would have provided for this also, that it should be altogether in a man's power not to fall into it. Now that which does not make a man worse, how can it make a man's life worse? But neither through ignorance, nor having the knowledge, but not the power to guard against or correct these things, it is possible that the nature of the universe has overlooked them, nor is it possible that it has made so great a mistake, either through want of power or want of skill, that good and evil should happen indiscriminately to the good and the bad. But death certainly, and life, honor and dishonor, pain and pleasure, all these things equally happen to good men and bad, being things which make us neither better nor worse. Therefore they are neither good nor evil. How quickly all things disappear, in the universe the bodies themselves, but in time the remembrance of them. What is the nature of all sensible things, and particularly those which attract with the bait of pleasure or terrify by pain, or are noised abroad by vapory fame? How worthless and contemptible and sordid and perishable and dead they are. All this it is the part of the intellectual faculty to observe. To observe, too, who these are whose opinions and voices give reputation, what death is, and the fact that if a man looks at it in itself, and by the abstractive power of reflection resolves into their parts all the things which present themselves to the imagination in it, he will then consider it to be nothing else than an operation of nature. And if anyone is afraid of an operation of nature, he is a child. This, however, is not only an operation of nature, but it is also a thing which conduces to the purposes of nature. To observe, too, how man comes near to the deity, and by what part of him, and when this part of man is so disposed. Unquote. So, let's take a minute to unpack some stuff here. It reads very poetically, and so it takes a little bit of work to figure out very specifically what he's talking about. So, Marcus Aurelius writes to remind himself, and us by remarkable coincidence, really, that at any moment you could die. I mean, you could just have a stroke or a heart attack, a clot, he was a military commander, being an emperor and everything. I mean, you could just be attacked in your sleep, that kind of thing. Any moment you could die. So, this is important to think about from time to time, right? Because this idea asks us to evaluate our lives as though they were bookended right where we stand today. The point is not morbidity, but an internal reflection of how we have lived and how we intend to live in the future. Da Vinci supposedly said that, as a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a life well spent brings a happy death. Another important aspect of the quoted section is that death, like all things to the Stoics, who are fatalists after a fashion, are inevitable and merely the operations of nature. And since death is inevitable, there's really no reason to get all worked up about it, except in the sense that one ought to be aware of the operations of nature so that one can live in harmony with it. Like many ancient religious views, Taoism would be an Eastern example. Maybe I'll do a video on that one day. Nature is a very important central pillar of their philosophizing. Interestingly, there's a whole informal fallacy that covers this, which the naturalistic fallacy, which more or less states that we can't derive moral truths from the state of things as we find them. Some people disagree with this, and it's a debate that is still ongoing to a good extent. But this isn't a video on fallacies, but it's just important to understand that many of the ancients took moral naturalism for granted, because this helps us understand the way the ideas in the Meditations and other books are grounded. This is why Aurelius writes about reputation and death and the general flow of things that, when considered rationally, quote, he will consider it to be nothing else than an operation of nature, and if anyone is afraid of an operation of nature, he is a child, unquote. The idea here being that we must be strong and not fear death, but merely view it as another kind of darkness. We know there is no boogeyman as we mature, and we must in turn come to mature about our view of death in like manner. For Aurelius, either one goes to the gods, who are by nature good and not evil, and therefore not to be feared, or one's essence simply dissolves into the void, which is also not scary because there's no sensation whatsoever. All sensation and thought under that view would eventually dissolve, including our understanding of our accomplishments, the accomplishments of others, our bodies, our thoughts, our monuments, everything. In the middle of the first paragraph I quoted, there's a really interesting part where he discusses how things are so constituted as to be generally good. Quote, "Now that which does not make a man worse, how can it make a man's life worse? But neither through ignorance, nor having the knowledge, but not the power to guard against or correct these things, is it possible that the nature of the universe has overlooked them, nor is it possible that it has made so great a mistake, either through want of power or want of skill, etc." In other words, he doesn't see a malevolent universe premise in his view of things. He regards the operations of nature to be basically good, and if not good, then at the very least necessary. There's a kind of reverence for nature there that is very interesting to me. And that human beings have, by their nature, the power to produce good and right actions, and these actions are generally rewarded by the operations of nature in its own way, so that what is perceived to be bad or evil is not necessarily actually so, but is only perceived that way through our own ignorance of the necessary ways that nature behaves, including death, which paves the way for further life and impels us to be the best selves that we can be, for it is a precious thing and we only get one try. It's interesting how the same sentiment or notion can be colored with a multiplicity of reactions to it. Contrast, for example, the YOLO idea that impels people to do self-destructive, dangerously spontaneous things. Bro, let me watch me jump off this cliff, it'll be sick. Versus the Stoic idea of realizing that you've only got one life, and so you should make the best of it and live well. Taking risks that produce worthy rewards, living in a generally dignified manner, understanding that everything is impermanent, and striving forward in any case to do what is right and good. Some people see death and react in a cynical or nihilistic way towards it. Others see it as a reason to live fully. It is up to all of us to decide how to view this inevitable fact of life. Personally, I take it as a reason to grasp the cup of life and guzzle it down to the last drop. I hope you all will join me in like manner. Cheers. Keep your wits about you. Peace.